Hi, hello, it's me again, and this is chapter 9 of His Leading Light, a fic written by Emotional Logic. And the chapter name is A Long Search and More Problems. So let's get into it. Taking an extra moment to look over his work, a movement in his peripheral caught his gaze. And Nezu turned to finish his own brewing tea and Aizawa-kun's coffee just in time to place the two cups on their rightful places before the sensors in the hallway and on the front door made it open just as Aizawa-kun walked through it. Nezu was well aware that his former personal student was somewhat less fond of his little tricks than he was himself, but he couldn't find it in him to care about that, especially not when weighed up against the absolute delight he got every time someone walked through the door with their hand in the air, still halfway on his way to knocking, looking slightly bewildered, if not somehow nervous, only to try to hide it, as if Nezu doesn't have dozens of cameras on that door recording every one of those reactions. Yes, he has a compilation video with the best reactions he's gotten so far, and yes, he watches it every once in a while, cackling to himself like a madman. Well, mad animal. Even so, taking Aizawa-kun's half-hearted tired stare in stride, Nezu motioned to the teacher to sit down in front of the steaming coffee cup as he himself took a small sip of his cup of tea. "What have you gotten so far?" As usual, his Aizawa-kun was right on business, though there was a hint of urgency breaking through his normally oh-so-neutral tone of voice. That's good, Nezu thought himself as he took another sip of his tea, both to get on Aizawa's nerves a bit for just jumping on task without formalities, and also as a hint to Aizawa that he should drink some of his coffee before they start the conversation. The man was going to need it. Aizawa-kun at last took the hint, and Nezu began answering before the coffee cup had made its way back into its place on the table. "I, unfortunately, have been kept quite busy by the Hero Commission for the past hour, as they have decided, once again, for reasons I loathe to understand, to meddle in this girl's affairs." If Nezu came off as more annoyed than usual, then that was just to be expected, given the nature of having someone else try to encroach on your territory. Taking a single breath to calm himself, Nezu continued. "But in the time before that, I managed to gather up a pretty damning case against the Aldera School District. And I was just going to look over a couple more details before contacting the police department to see if they might want to put in their 2 cents. I know Tsukauchi-san has shown to have a soft spot for discrimination cases." As he spoke, Nezu had kept both paws on his teacup, his eyes studying his former student's expression to see if he could gaze any outward reactions to anything he was saying. Now, Nezu had known Aizawa Shora since he transferred into the heroics course when he was 15. He quickly thereafter became Nezu's personal student, meaning that Nezu had been with Aizawa since the beginning. Nezu was there when little Aizawa-kun learned to perfect how he masks his emotions. So Nezu also knows the small signs to look for when those masks start to break apart. And he did. The feelings shining through most were a nice mix of impatience and worry. Any more news on where Midoriya is right now? Aizawa-kun's voice was was still trying to hide the impotent worry, but the wording itself made it all too clear enough. Unfortunately, given that the school doesn't seem to keep any of their paperwork digitally, there is very little I can do to know whether he's been in attendance today. Couple that with the school's lack of surveillance system. Nezu's voice faded out as he suddenly put the cup of tea down, and his paws quickly went racing over the keyboard in search of something. It didn't take long before he got it, and when he did, Nezu's mouth was upturned in what he was clearly mimicking a small grin as he turned the computer screen in front of him to show Aizawa-kun some CCTV footage of his residual area. I present to you Midoriya Izuku's home apartment, Nezu said, the cursor on the screen hovering over the entrance to one of the apartment complexes on the screen. And so, if we just... Nezu began tampering with the keyboard again, and not long after the video began speeding backwards. It wasn't often, but at any time someone entered or exited the entrance, Nezu would stop the footage to look at to see if it could be Midoriya-kun before continuing going backwards when it was clear that it could not. It was clear that Aizawa-kun was getting more anxious the longer it was taken to find him. And Nezu was beginning to feel some of that as well. They were doing fine in the beginning, none of them really expecting to see the kid exit the house after school had started, but Nezu checked just to be sure. Once they had passed school start, Aizawa-kun was beginning to grow anxious. But Nezu kept calm as to show his former student that there was no reason not to be. After all, maybe Midoriya could decide not to go to school due to the events of last night. Are you sure this is the right place? The small shake in his voice was so unlike what Nezu was used to. He looked over as to double-check that it had been indeed him talking. Maybe they moved and forgot to update their information? Nezu didn't need to say anything. He saw the expression of Aizawa-kun's face when they looked at each other, and they both knew that wasn't the case. Instead, Nezu made a show to look up at the clock in the wall. I will continue looking for Midoriya-kun through the surveillance footage and see what I can find out. In the meantime, I believe you have a class to attend. Nezu didn't miss the way his former student's attention stepped back at the mention of the boy they were looking for. But it wasn't simply the mention that had caught his attention. No, Aizawa-kun knew very well how Nezu referred to people, and so he knew that Nezu only used the kun honorific when referring to people that were his. Nezu had done this on purpose, both to hopefully get Aizawa-kun out of the stupor he was currently in, but also to just subtly prepare him for the fact that Midoriya-kun was going to be his new personal student, and if nothing else, to reassure that Nezu was going to do anything in his power to find the missing kid. After a moment of thinking, and just truantly scanning Nezu with his eyes, looking for something, Aizawa-kun seemed to finally pick up on everything Nezu had wanted him to, because he gave a single nod before standing up and leaving the office without a word. Nezu didn't bother to linger on it as he went back to speeding the surveillance footage backwards. He needed to find his kid as quickly as possible, after all. Aizawa Shoda was running on autopilot from the moment he stood up and walked out of the principal's office to the moment he was back in the teacher's lounge. He had just had his class of ethics with 1H, and though he had known it was unwise to enter in a support class without his situational awareness being at 100%, it had gone as well as it could have. Though On the second thought, that was mostly likely his reputation doing the heavy lifting. No one had dared to try to start tinkering with the project behind his back, and so he had managed to completely avoid any unnecessary explosions. Now he was sitting at his desk in the teacher's lounge. Zashi had started talking his ear out about something some minutes ago, but Shoda had been able to process any of what had been said until Zashi's voice suddenly drifted off. When Shoda looked up at him to see what made him stop, he found his husband looking at him with a worried expression. "So?" It was a quiet question, but it was said with such compassion and care that Shoda just wanted to break down right then and there. Looking around the lounge and seeing that there were the only two people in the room, Shoda allowed himself to turn the chair around to open his arms in a silent question for a hug. It took maybe 2 seconds before Hizashi was sitting in his lap, arms around him and hugging him tightly. A lot of people like to make the assumption that Shoda didn't like physical contact, but that couldn't be further from the truth. He was just socially awkward about it, not quite sure what was appropriate and what not at any given time, and so he preferred to just avoid it instead. But with the ones he cared about and were close to, if he could have one arm around every one of his close friends at all times, he would. "Do you want to talk about it?" Hizashi asked him with such a soft and voice and tone, and Shoda wanted to just melt into his husband's arms and stay there indefinably. How was he even supposed to explain what was worrying him? His brain had been working back and forth for an hour, going through the fact that the only two options they had at the moment were either that Midoriya was already dead, or that Midoriya was going to be the rat's new personal student, just like he had once been. And it wasn't that Shoda would ever rather Midoriya die than become Nezu's personal student. Of course not. Between the two, the latter was very much preferred. No, the worrying part was that Nezu had decided that Midoriya was his without even having met the boy yet. And the rat didn't just do that. As far as Shoda knew, he was the only human that Nezu had claimed ownership over, which had been really difficult to deal with when he suddenly figured out what the principal's change in honorific had meant. He had eventually grown used to it, not like he had much choice. But the thing is that there was a change. Nezu hadn't decided on the spot. And so the question that followed was, what does Nezu know about Midoriya that I don't? Nezu hadn't even known that what he looked like or that he was quirkless, and he definitely didn't decide that Midoriya was his just because he was a suicidal kid. Shota buried his face into his husband's neck and shook his head slightly against him. "Not now. Maybe later." Hizashi didn't answer him verbally, just tightening the hug slightly in a light squeeze as to say that he understood. And then they just sat like that for as long as they could. As it turned out, the two of them were the only teachers who didn't have a lesson that period, and so they got to sit alone in the quiet for quite some time before one of them looked at the time, seeing that the other teachers would be coming in just a few minutes. They reluctantly let go of the hug, and instead Hizashi sat beside. They continued working separately, softly holding hands whilst they did so, as different teachers started coming and going. Nezu was growing impatient and more worried as the time went on. He was beginning to wonder whenever he actually had the right address when he finally spotted Midorizuku. But that didn't make any sense. Nezu had looked at the blueprints at the apartment complex and also the apartment that would have been Midoriya's. There was only one exit and entrance to the building. And so how was he now looking at the footage of Midorizuku coming home after school 2 days ago? Had this been correct, Midorizuku would have never met Aizawa-kun yesterday, and so Nezu did the only logical thing. He found every walkable route between the apartment and the junior high and got to work thoroughly looking through the CCTV footage that covered each of those roads so as to carefully map out Midoriya-kun's path home from school. For some reason, and raising some alarm bells in his head, Nezu was unable to find any CCTV footage that covered the school grounds. But he found the camera where Midoriya and the rest of the students would last appear before school and first after school, and so that had to be the entrance to the schoolyard. As he had followed the boy backwards on his way home, he at one point, about halfway to the route, noticed that Midoriya-kun was out of breath, only moments before he started running. Well, it was closer to sprinting, actually, and as he got closer to the school, the sprinting became quicker, until he got to the school entrance and saw that he was being chased. It was almost a bit subtle with the way the camera was angled, but from the way the other kids were moving, it was very much looking like they were halting their momentum as they entered the frame. Did these kids know about the cameras? Either way, Nezu didn't like what he was seeing. He couldn't wait to tear the school down brick for brick. But for now, that would have to wait. Next thing Nezu did was fast forward the camera exactly 24 hours so that he could hopefully follow the boy's journey between school and meeting Aizawa-kun. For a minute, Nezu considered that maybe he had fast forwarded too much and Midoriya-kun had simply left before school was actually over, but he was stuck to watching as, one by one, the last students exited the schoolyard. It was 2 minutes after the last student had left that Midoriya-kun finally came walking out of the school. He wasn't running like he had been the day before, and if anything, he was barely walking. There was close to no speed in his pace as the boy looked through what looked like a wet notebook with scorch marks on the cover. Nezu sped up the footage a bit, having to stop and look through as Midoriya almost immediately started to walk another way home than he had the day before. It didn't take too long for Nezu to figure out which route the boy was taking. It was a considerably longer walk, but maybe Midoriya-kun was just in need of some fresh air and time to think. He followed Midoriya-kun through the different streets. The city didn't cover every meter, of course, and so there were a couple instances where he had to go looking through other cameras due to the boy rounding a corner where Nezu couldn't see it, and that he thought he would take a different direction. But other than that, it was rather easy, and it looked to be a nice and uneventful walk. That is, until Midoriya-kun was going to walk under an underpass. Now, there was no footage of the underpass, but Nezu had the map beside him, and there was no other direction it would have made sense for the boy to walk, except when he switched to the camera on the other side of the underpass, there was no sign of the boy. Double-checking that there were no other paths out of the underpass that wouldn't lead to him being in frame for the camera, Nezu decided to watch that camera for a bit longer. Maybe Midoriya-kun had just rested against the wall of the underpass. Nezu couldn't say why he would, but that was the only thing that made sense, was for the boy to have paused inside the underpass for some reason. Nezu had been watching the footage at normal speed for some time and just decided to begin speeding up the video because this was taking way longer than he expected. But almost as soon as he went to make the footage speed up, he saw Midoriya-kun being thrown at high speed out of the underpass and onto the pavement path leading out. Nezu immediately snapped to attention, and he could feel the way his eyes widened at the look at the boy. He was looking ruffled and bruised, and he was covering in some kind of green sludge. But worst of all, he wasn't moving. He'd clearly been thrown in with force, but as far as Nezu could tell from what little he could see on the screen, and from what he knew after his talk with Aizawa earlier, there was zero chance that the kid was dead. After all, this all would have happened before Midoriya's meeting with the man later that night. Now that he was thinking about it, the man's recollection came to mind. The hero should be here soon, shouldn't he? The one Aizawa-kun was so set on removing the license of. 4 minutes went by before this hero showed up, and Nezu could feel the hairs on his body stand on edge as he watched the current #1 hero, All Might, walk up to the unconscious teenager Nezu had claimed as one of his own and slapping the kid awake. It took more self-control than it should have. Nezu did not growl at the screen as Midoriya threw up more of that green sludge that he was covered in, and the hero moved to leave him there. Nezu cursed the lack of audio on the cameras as he watched Midoriya say something. The boy walked out of frame, and Nezu looked through the different cameras covering the area he was reminded of. He was reminded of what Aizawa had told him about the flight. He had no way of knowing where to look next without getting some more information on the subject. Sending a message to Aizawa asking for the address of whatever building he had encountered Midoriya on top of, Nezu went to save the video files of the encounter between Midoriya and Toshinori-san. Nezu then went back to the correspondence between himself and a member of the Hero Public Safety Commission. He hadn't bothered to look at it since Aizawa came over for lunch. He had had more important things to look at the time. Now, Nezu wouldn't say he regretted what he decided to spend his time on. Midoriya was more important than this. But his decision had consequences. The commission had sent 2 new emails since then, the second one asking that the first one be ignored. He had given them the time to think. The APSC were pushing his paw, demanding that he hire All Might as a heroics teacher at UA indefinitely beginning next school year. At the beginning, Nezu had refused more on principle. They had no right to encroach on his territory and demand things of him and his school. But he had no personal reason to deny it other than that he didn't like the way they had approached him with the idea. Now, Nezu had a more personal reason not to want this to go through. After all, next year was going to be the beginning of Midoriya's stay at UA, and Nezu would not be responsible for forcing the boy to be on the same grounds as that man if he could avoid it. Although reading through the last email he had received, that would not be as easy as one might think. There was a reason Nezu usually had any and all correspondence he got from the Hero Commission set to urgent, because if he took time to answer, that meant allowing them the same courtesy. Nezu, as well as most of his staff, had been trying for years to change the Hero Course entrance exam. It was biased and simply a horrible way of testing a person's capability as a hero. The test had no way to gauge a student's moral, personality, or overall goals, which were pretty important when it came to hero work. This was one of the reasons Nezu was so willing to let Aizawa continue with his explosions. It helped that it seemed to annoy the commission. But even then, it would be so much easier just to change the exam and let more capable students in the first place. The Hero Commission was putting this to a test. In short terms, their newest offer was basically an ultimatum. They would let Nezu add a personality test to the exam, not at all what Nezu had asked for, and in exchange, Nezu would give All Might a position among UA staff. If Nezu didn't agree, they would take this as a sign that the Heroics exam functions well as it is, and this would essentially close all future discussions on the topic. This mail was, of course, a lot longer, and written in such more convoluted and roundabout, bureaucratic way, but those were the essentials of it all. Had Nezu had his way, the commission wouldn't have any say in how he runs his school. But unfortunately, this was one area where Nezu was not allowed to argue. The Hero Public Safety Commission was, after all, responsible for all Japan heroes and the process of becoming one, and as such, they had a say in the entrance exam of every hero school in the country, even the private ones. A personality test wasn't even close to what Nezu had asked for. The commission, of course, knew this. They knew that Nezu knew this. Personality tests were about as reliable as zodiac signs, especially given the fact that anybody who takes it can just lie about themselves. But that was the point. It was just about to close enough to what Nezu had actually asked for that denying it could easily be framed in the future as you are not wanting to change the exams after all. At the very least, if they accepted the offer, it would keep the discussion open and allow them the chance to change it for the better in the future, even if that meant the next few years of hero hopefuls would be taking a meaningless test in the meantime. Well, it wouldn't exactly be meaningless. Nezu could probably find a way to at least weed out the worst of the worst. Maybe Aizawa-kun would like to help him out, given his experience with exactly that kind of hero hopefuls. The more he thought it through, the less even the scales became. There wasn't much of a choice. The commission had managed to put him in a corner, and so the next question was really more so, how do we avoid Midoriya-kun and All Might having to interact as much as possible? And also possibly, how to remove the symbol of peace, hero license, and still keep Japan standing in the aftermath. The second one would be a lot more difficult than the first one, but at least, maybe, it could ease Aizawa-kun's worries to know that, as a teacher at UA, All Might would be less active as a hero elsewhere. They would just have to be extra careful, making sure Toshinori-san didn't teach their students to copy any of his misconducts. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 9, and as always, I welcome any constructive criticism and any thoughts if you have some, and well, have a great night and or day. Well, yeah. Bye-bye.